All right. I think we just have to start up again as people are gradually coming back from lunch. We are now going into kind of a two-part session. All the way back in the beginning, when we started discussing this seminar part of the program with Eric, he mentioned this idea of inviting two scholars from different fields approaching the theme of representation, which is why we have placed these two talks under the headline of Reprazent. So I will introduce both of them now, and they will follow directly after each other. But we will try to take questions from each one in between. So first up is Gyda Marås Sindre. She is a research fellow at the Department of Comparative Politics here at the University of Bergen, but currently based at the University of Cambridge. Her work is broadly focused on the political behavior of rebel groups during peace processes, on notions on sovereignty and statehood, and on democratization. You can read the full bios of each speaker in your handouts. I will not go through all of it. Lina Dzuverovic is a curator based in Zagreb, Croatia, and London. Currently, she is a PhD candidate at an AHRC-funded studentship between the Tate and the Royal College of Art in London. She has a very diverse and active background as a curator. I will not go through all of her projects, but some of you might know at least some of the projects that have been presented in Norway before. Lina was executive director of the London-based curatorial agency Electra, which she co-founded in 2003. Electra was also presented their project Her Noise here at Landmark quite a few years ago. And from other examples, Lina has worked on the exhibition 27 Senses that was presented in Chisenhale Gallery at London and at the Kunstmuseum Kube in Ålesund. And she has been the co-curator of the biennial Momentum in Moss together with Stina Högqvist, and that was in 2009. So she's been quite present also in the Norwegian art scene. But first now, I'll give the word to Gyda.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm just very honored actually to be here to talk to this audience about a topic that has been occupying my mind for probably the past, at least as a student and as a researcher, for the past decade. And as you mentioned in the introduction, my vantage point or my research interests. I'm with the Department of Comparative Politics, which means that I'm a political scientist. And I'm interested in those institutions that Leon and Max sort of just briefly mentioned and talked about in sort of a general level in the introductory talk we had this morning. I'm interested in how these institutions work in relation to secessionist mobilization in different parts of the world. And myself, I've been doing sort of on-the-ground work in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, which are quite different secessionist struggles. But the themes are similar to other secessionist movements and secessionist territories, such as Abkhazia and South Ossetia and other sort of non-recognized states. And I'm also interested in the movement, the political movements, how they transform, how identities transform within movements over time. And with Abkhazia, we're lucky in the sense that we've had 20 years of statehood in the sense of, in the context of non-recognition in the international system. But we're still talking about the state as very present in relation to Abkhazia. And that's my vantage point. And I'll try to do four things today. Just from the political science point of view, I'll provide a clarification of what actually constitutes a non-recognized state, how do we analyze and how do we understand it in the context of international law and in the context of the political realities on the ground. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is what Leon and Max just sort of touched upon in the end in their discussion, is on this issue of internal legitimacy, which relates very specifically to notions of political representation inside a country and how politics and how individuals are represented in relation to political institutions in the context of political transformation. And then connected to that, how does that tie to external legitimacy, which is really a key strategy for non-recognized states, is gaining that sort of the utopia of the statehood, but also that international recognition, so they can function as sovereign entities in the world. And from that, try and touch upon whether we see a transformation of sovereignty in the world, the concept of sovereignty, and where that leaves us in relation to conflict resolution. But what we have to remember is that Abkhazia is one of those territories where we haven't seen a conflict resolution yet. We haven't seen a peace agreement. We don't quite see where it's going. Are we going towards a sort of autonomy structure? Are we going towards final international recognition? What's Russia going to do in this context, in the geopolitical arena? We haven't actually mentioned the giant to the north yet. So that's what I will do for the next 25 minutes or so. And this, and within that is related to notions of democracy, of course, which is the core concept of representation in political terms. And this is the photo I've chosen here is from an election in Abkhazia, which relates to also the activities of inhabitants and how inhabitants relate to the state in very practical terms. And I'll come back to talking about democracy and democratization in these contexts. I just want to show you this map. It's a map where you see boundaries of the state. You see them very clearly demarcated. But I played around with it and dotted the red flames, which represent geographically the active secessionist movements that we have in the world today. And these are self-determination movements that are mobilized for an extensive period of time to gain some sort of autonomy, control, opportunities to build an independent state of their own, usually in ethnic terms. So an ethnic group seeking a breakaway from their parent state. And as I mentioned, my work has been based in the Southeast Asia region, and you see several of those conflicts there. And then you also see moving up towards Central Asia, the border north of India and Pakistan. You see secessionist mobilization that's been extensive and prolonged for a period of time, usually more than 2 decades. And these reflect the sort of the porousness of international boundaries, that we have a perception of state boundaries from the map as being permanent. But the further you get from sort of the capital of the state into the periphery, the less reach the central state has into these regions. And that's where you have fluctuation in terms of whether there are groups that are mobilizing for self-determination or something called irredentism, joining with other countries. And of course, into Europe, we see also several of them. The green circles are what we call unrecognized states. These are the entities that have gained a de facto independence. And let me just sort of dwell a bit on that notion of de facto independence or de facto statehood. So in the classical view, which is the view from which places like Abkhazia have not gained independence, or the international recognition for independence, is according to international law at least, that sovereignty is fixed, exogenous is an attribute of the state. So either you're sovereign or you're not a state. So that's within the international law framework, and it's been dominant since the Second World War, so it's sort of been permanent. And within that, we have the rules of non-intervention between states, right? So it's sort of you're crossing a boundary, so intervening into a sovereign state, into the territory of a sovereign state. So what are the practical solution of sort of not having statehood? what's the practical consequences of not having state? It really means that you have lost the right to negotiate and the right to conclude international agreements. So that's a pretty big type of consequence to have. It means that you can't travel with your passport. So for Abkhazia, there's been a practical solution of having Russian passports for most of the citizens. But it also means in practical terms that you are not protected from non-intervention. So, and without the protection of Russia, Georgia can, of course, militarily intervene again into these territories. And it also means the sort of a limitation to the practical solution of building a state. So you're not allowed to enter into international trade agreements, for instance. So that places limitations to the prospects for economic development within the country. However, in the political sciences, we tend to look at the to study the realities, at least from my perspective, we do, and look at the de facto characteristics of the states, the capacity that exists, and we can talk about de facto sovereignty. And from that vantage point, we can count, as Nina Kaspersen is a researcher at York University and a distinguished expert on unrecognized statehood. She's written a book a wonderful book on unrecognized states, and she's counted 17 territories in the world after 1999 that can be considered unrecognized territories or unrecognized states, and 20 if you include places like Kosovo, Taiwan, and Western Sahara, so halfway border places. Since then, at the moment, there are probably only 6 left of those that have managed to retain the territorial control. And these are Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the breakaway from Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Somaliland, Transnistria, and Northern Cyprus. So we can look at them broadly on the map. So quite a sort of wide geographical spread there. An unrecognized state has achieved de facto independence, which means that it covers most of the territory it claims to control, to be part of the boundaries. There's a leadership that seeks to build state institutions, and we'll come back to discussing the notions of state institutions in a bit. And they also seek legitimacy as sort of rulers within that state. And the entity has also has not gained international recognition except from perhaps a patron, like Russia has guaranteed for them, or recognized Abkhazia. And these territories are born out of war, but so are most states. That's not something new. But they're really the very embodiment of secessionist struggles. So the separatists have won, at least temporarily, and they've been able to maintain control of the territory for a sustained period of time. And they sort of have to start developing some sort of relation with or civilians or people inhabitants living in the territory have to sort of adhere to that authority. So this is just to show you the map. We can draw maps even with unrecognized states, and it's actually, if we look at the National Geographic webpage where they have interactive maps, it's quite striking that the unrecognized territories are there quite clearly demarcated. It doesn't mean that National Geographic recognizes it or provides a sort of self-determination claim, but at least the map can tell us a lot of things. And I think it shows us some sort of increased recognition that these places have to be dealt with, especially in the current international climate where we're trying to propose and resolve internal conflicts in different parts of the world as a prerequisite for global security, in a sense. In this exhibition, Eric Baudelaire has asked us whether entities such as Abkhazia are, if they're fictitious, if they're temporary. And whether they're sort of temporary, that depends on their ability to control the territory. And whether they're able to sort of maintain the internal security. And that relates to sort of what we call as different phases of state building historically. So manage to sort of create a physical control of the territory. So control it, primarily through own military forces or with the support of external forces, and also to establish legitimate use of violence, the classical Weberian terms of statehood. But even in places like Abkhazia, or in particular in Abkhazia, it's of course been problematic as well. There are border regions towards Georgia where this is problematic, and it relates to the notion of who belongs to the state and who doesn't. So there's of course a discourse and a discussion of groups that are being excluded, in particular related to Georgians who have been forcibly displaced after the 2008 war. But there's more to state building than delivering security, of course. And this is what was mentioned earlier in terms of the practical practical obligation of governance. So state building is not something only about identity, about creating a sense of belonging. It's actually, let's face it, the practical solution to how to govern a society. So provide electricity, to provide water, eventually healthcare, education, and that sort of thing. And this is what makes up that social contract between the authorities and the people living within that territory. But there's also quite an important aspect to this, and that's also that I think state building is something else as well. And I think, Max, you touched upon this very sort of emotionally in your within the film, and also in the introduction, in the conversation earlier, that it has something to do with national identity. It has something to do with being a member of a community. And in politics or in theory, we usually talk about national identity, but perhaps in ethnically plural societies, we can talk about internal legitimacy as a more pragmatic way to approach this, whether the state has legitimacy. Because is a common identity necessary for a state? For instance, look at the United States. You can have multiple identities. Historically, you can be an American belonging to the United States, but you can also be a Puerto Rican and Norwegian descendant, etc. And it's a complex process. And this is probably not solved in many countries, but at least it's worth discussing in multiple societies. And what matters really is if the state has internal legitimacy. Max also touched upon an important aspect. You said, well, why did we choose democracy? Why did we choose these institutions when we decided to build our state? Why didn't we become a monarchy? The monarch, Max. Why not? Well, this is moving into the next topic of my talk, is really links to internal legitimacy and the role that notions of democracy and democratization and human rights, respect for minorities has within the framework of the international community, within the UN, and also in just a general discourse of the world. So to some, democracy and de facto states might seem a paradox. They're after all based on exclusion, right? Because they have sort of said we are separate. We are separate from the other. We are separate from Georgia. We're separate from Russia. We belong to Abkhazia. This is our territory. We belong to South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh. This is our territory. It's a process of exclusion. We say you can be a part of this, but you have to accept the general rules. This is Abkhazia. So in his famous book, The Evils of Self-Determination, Etzioni, an author, wrote about the sort of a new unproductive strain of self-determination, which he claimed to undermine democracy. So according to him, breakaway territories would lack, per definition, pluralism and tolerance required for democracy to prosper. So the reason for this was that self-determination is, per definition, based on the process of exclusion. However, I would say that most of these de facto states have embraced some sort of democratic notion of statehood. So most of them have had multi-party elections, and most of them have had a change of ruler, also Abkhazia, several. And most of them have sort of engaged political parties, and there's been a turnover of presidents. and some sort of commitment to democratic institutions. And research shows that internal legitimacy, which perhaps relates to internal sovereignty, is dependent not only on whether this government or the state can provide water and electricity, so the public goods, but also whether they can provide the democracy. And protection also includes protection for human rights, which is very much linked to democracy, right? And I think what we see, we've had 20 years in Abkhazia at the moment, so 20 years of being able to measure this. And we also had 20 years for Georgia to be outside of the sort of Soviet fold, right? So you had two contexts that have developed pretty much in a similar direction. Both of them score sort of as semi-democratic or semi-plural societies, semi-free on these sort of international rankings. And both of them can said to have internal problems in terms of democracy. But at least there is a parallel process that links to that discussion. And I think also in terms of external legitimacy, the democracy issue is very much prevalent. So what we've seen in the past 20 years, there's been a shift in the international system or international discourse towards an emphasis on democratization and human rights. So there's a shift in the international climate on sovereignty, which is a key driving force. So I think I read somewhere Marx and other sort of foreign ministers of non-recognized states have emphasized this, that we are as democratic as our parent states, or perhaps better. We are doing better than those states we broke away from. And from that, we deserve the international recognition because we are legitimate authorities. And this normative shift stems from different conditions in international law. So, for instance, when the former Yugoslav republics to gain their sovereignty in the 1990s, the first condition by the European community was to have rule of law, democracy, and human rights. And for Kosovo to gain independence, which is very much a role model for several of non-recognized states, this sort of crystallized this. Because Kosovo does not fit into the conventional rule of gaining independence. It wasn't a territory that had been occupied. It was a territory that was, by international law, not considered sovereign. But the mobilization for recognition of Kosovo as an independent state was very much linked to this independence through example, so that the ruling authorities would be more sort of legitimate, have a high degree of internal legitimacy, were better capable of preserving multicultural identities within the country and protecting minorities, which is an important turn in the international climate on non-recognition. And from this, I think, one of the most important aspects would be, I'll come back to that graph in a bit, that the claims to democratic values and the beginning in the process of democratization is related to contestation. That's clear. You compete in an election. But even perhaps more important, it's part of a construction. It's a part of a construction of state identity. And I'm leaving out the construction of national identity very deliberately here. And for both internal and external audiences, this is part of a narrative. It's part of a story that links struggles for self-determination, current freedoms, and future freedoms and protectorate of human rights and of minority rights. And the regime in Abkhazia and in other unrecognized states are making these direct links between process of democratization and their initial independence referendum, which is seen as sort of the first exercise in self-determination, the first exercise of democracy and popular support for the state. I'll just borrow this graph from a very recent publication by Kristin Bakke at the University College London, published International Studies Quarterly. And it's an analysis, it's a survey based on internal legitimacy in Abkhazia. And it sort of gives us a good indicators of the ethnic dimension that we haven't discussed earlier, but that there is a delinking between sort of it reflects sort of the tensions between democracy, so equal representation for everyone, perceptions of statehood, and future developments, expectations of the state, and it's whether it's temporary, whether it's going to last. Of course, there are these tensions within democracy, and in relation to political representation, that's pretty prevalent in relation to ethnicity, because there's competition and pluralism, which is entailed in democracy on the one side, and the claim to homogeneity contained sort of in nationalist discourses on the other side. And of course, there's always going to be a tension between that. I think perhaps Abkhazia is one of those territories that come out of this in a better way, primarily because the dominant ethnic group, Abkhaz, is not necessarily a majority. It wasn't a majority at the start of the war. It's a dominant group politically, dominant within parties, parliaments, and the executive. But it is also not a majority in numbers, so it has to integrate and relate, become sort of more pluralistic in its interaction with other groups. This is, if you look at Sri Lanka and the Tamil mobilization by the LTTE, one of the main problems there, of course, is the LTTE, which managed to establish a de facto state for quite an extensive period of time, for at least for 4 years, before its collapse. That was a sort of a more dominant block of ethnic domination by Tamils, which would not allow for ethnic pluralism, religious pluralism, or even political pluralism, political views. So that created a big problem there, and I think for Abkhazia that's probably more easily resolved. And it's also a question of, so this relates to the question of who are the people, the disjunction between ethnos and demos. What I want to say then is that, well, identities are not static. While states are not static, identities are not static either. So because of these different discourses, and even if this is sort of timely to embrace democracy, it is in the world today, as opposed to embracing socialism or anarchy, as it was in earlier periods of time as support for state building. At least there seems to be sort of a willingness to redefine nationhood and state identity in a more pluralistic manner, which is crucial. And this is just to bring us back to a little bit of sort of out of Abkhazia and to the broader. The notion of the sort of democracy and democratic elections is being embraced in all these territories that have not had international recognition. This is from Somaliland. This is from Aceh, where I work myself. In Aceh, they did not achieve self-determination, but a high degree of autonomy within the unitary state. And this is the former rebel group mobilizing as a political movement. And I also just want to draw attention, this is a courtesy of James Roslington at Cambridge University, that statehood and definition of sort of breakaway territories is not a new phenomenon. This is the period from 1910 to 1939 in Europe. And see there's a number peaking after the First World War, different experimental states. And as you see, some of them were ethnically based, and some of them were much more ideologically based. So sort of attempts to build alternative notions of statehood have been dominant historically as well. So what can we say from this in a concluding manner? As I opened initially, sort of the post-World War II map, as we see clearly demarcated boundaries, state boundaries. And we can see that even boundaries are not so determined. And increasingly, at least, conflict resolution in the ways being negotiated today within the context of maintaining sovereignty is usually with varying degrees of autonomy and various degrees of self-government. So federalism would be the classical resolution to some conflicts, whereas others, that's not long. That's not far enough to go. But at least there are, in the world where you have open trade bound, where you can sort of a globalized world where you can trade more easily. It seems to be that at least we can have a direction that does not necessarily mean self-determination or sovereignty in the very classical view, but we can find different alternative ways. We have examples: Channel Islands, Andorra, Malta, Monaco, Puerto Rico, the Cook Islands. We have different sort of sovereign territories in the world that have not necessarily reached the sort of enforced notion of sovereignty. And I just want to end there, and we can have questions now or at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any immediate questions or comments? Yeah.
Do you want to wait?
No, I think we could do it now. At least 5 minutes or with questions.
Okay, thank you. I just two reactions. One, not really questions, but just reactions to what you said. But first, can I ask a question? When you took that picture, were you standing on the?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. The comments are the following. I think because my experience in conflict resolution on these issues of separatist states has shown, for me at least, my experience is that there's two problems in the way the international community usually approaches separatist or self-declared states. And one of the problems is the assumption that these are movements which are not political, fundamentally. Right? The assumption that basically if you engage with the separatist state, you trade, you open up, they will eventually, and you create economic benefits for them to engage with the other state, etc., with their neighboring regions, that eventually they will give in. So this is kind of idea that they're fundamentally they're not political projects, they're economic projects that they have they do a cost-benefit analysis of engagement. And that, I think, is shown, I wonder for me at least, is shown to be completely wrong. That just economic engagement and cost-benefit analysis doesn't enter the game. Because no matter how blockaded, how isolated, how pressured separatist states are, they always continue. Because the drive is not economic, it's political. All right? It's very fundamental. Second mistake is that if you start any conflict resolution process from the outside, from the starting point that the separatist state has to renegotiate their notion of sovereignty to some lower level, to the federal level, it won't work. And I don't think it ever does. Why? Because fundamentally, states are about power, and the core of power is military power, and the essence of federation or confederation or any kind of structure like that is legal power. It's not military. So you're kind of delegating power from military generals to lawyers, and that requires belief in the rule of law. That requires for you to believe that law actually has some legitimacy, that law is a way of recourse, and you can get what you want through law. None of these places is there a trust in law, and no belief in law as a way which will adequately protect their interests. So there you have, in most cases, I'm just wondering about the ones I've dealt with in the former Soviet Union, that's the way the international community has approached all of these three cases. None of them have succeeded, and they've been around for 20 years, and they'll be around for another 20 years.
Probably, yeah. I can just sort of briefly, of course, you're completely right. My vantage point, of course, is also relates to the. I didn't discuss this, but there are internal changes within the sort of the states as well. So the parent states, or whatever you would call them, would require some sort of a political transformations within that entity as well. And the context that I've been studying, especially in Indonesia, you've had sort of during a long period of dictatorship. So we had a secession struggle that lasted for 30 years. Periods flowing up and down, certain periods of territorial control, fall back, etc. But then a shift of government, a shift of a very sort of ongoing decentralization process, so already sort of an acceptance for decentralization within the government. And also an international commitment that stretched beyond to sort of formalizing a federal solution. So in some places where you've had that complete democratization parallel with the decentralization process, as you had in Indonesia, that seemed to be possible, at least for the case of Aceh. And it was also what made it possible for East Timor to finally get their international, or not, to get their independence, because after all, Indonesia did allow them to break away, even though it was sort of very strong force from the international community. So perhaps we don't have to necessarily only study the strategies within the conflict resolution. It has to be, well, I wouldn't use, perhaps we want to use the term ripe moment, but ripe not in the classical sense, but it also has to be some sort of acceptance for pluralism within the state as well, and probably we don't see that in Georgia at the moment, and we definitely don't see it necessarily in Russia. So, yeah.
I was wondering if you could just walk us through the graph that you were showing us, and just tell us a little bit how to read it, where it comes from, and how it was made.
Yeah, obviously, as I said, it's not my study, but it was conducted by Elisabeth Bakke, who's a lecturer or research professor at UCL in London, and her colleagues. And it's a survey based on, I think, 10,000 respondents. And the details for how it was carried out, I think I can actually forward you the article directly. But it is methodologically, it's actually quite an extensive study and a good survey, which is very difficult to carry out in such an area. But it has tried to disaggregate internal legitimacy in different ways, and there are different graphs within the research project. But this particular, and the reason why I chose it, it has to do with the view on Abkhazia as a state, as a status in relation to ethnicity. And it's related to part of the Russian Federation or Georgia. So they have that compartmentalized into one category as an independent state, where it's difficult to say, so you have that option to cross in the survey, and that you don't want to answer, of course. And it does show, it's surprising in the sense that it does not show. There's a difference between the ethnic groups, but the difference is not that big. That's why it is interesting. So when it comes to whether it should be part of Georgia or the Russian Federation, the group that is most politicized in this issue, the Georgian, is actually just above 20% in this survey. But we can always discuss the methodological aspects of the survey, but I chose it because I think it's one of the few reasons that it actually shows something from a good vantage point. Yes?
The survey is saying that 50% of Abkhaz Georgians responded that their preference is for Abkhazia to remain independent.
Yes.
And the other way to...
80.
Okay.
80%.
No, of Georgians.
Oh, yes, yes.
And then are we to assume that the 20% of Abkhaz who responded that they would prefer to be part of the Russian Federation, and 22% of the Georgian population would prefer to be attached to Georgia? But that...
But what we should think is, we should remember that we haven't distinguished between Russian Federation and Georgia.
And that's an interesting... Important. So the idea is not to be specific, is just to talk about independent versus non-independent, and not discuss Russia versus Georgia. I see. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, thank you once again. Very good presentation. And as I said in the... As I said in the introduction, some of you were gradually coming back from lunch, so I might repeat it. We're going to go straight into the next talk. these two talks are going to be very different. They are placed together under the common headline of representation, which was, as I said, an idea that we talked, that Eric talked about all the way from the beginning when we started discussing this seminar, to invite two different scholars to talk about this topic from different angles. So one would be political representation, and the other more maybe artistic representation or image representation. So we're moving into the second part. Lina.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much to Bergen Kunsthall and everyone who's worked on this project, and to Eric also for inviting me here to be part of what I find a really fascinating project. And it's fantastic to be back in Bergen, which it's been a few years now. So my perspective obviously is very different. I'm a curator, and I'm fully involved in the field of contemporary art, not politics at all. But my interest in questions of representation and artistic autonomy stems from a need to question the framing of artistic works, so the context in which artistic works appear, which I think, for me, is central to the work of any curator and artist also. So not just thinking about the work itself, but its context. So during my talk, I would like us to think about the questions of autonomy, artistic autonomy, or to put into question the very possibility of artistic autonomy in the first place, as we think of the relationship between representation and art. And I'm going to start by looking at a term that's very well known in politics, in international relations, but not so much in culture, which is the term soft power, as one of the tools in the nation-building apparatus of the state, and to try to juxtapose this against possible positions of cultural workers. So on the one hand, so in my talk I will look at two positions, starting with soft power, so this sort of top-down way of looking at culture, and then I will shift into the position of the artist, ending up with quite a specific artistic strategy, which comes from a term from Slavoj Žižek, which is over-identification. So what is soft power? Soft power is a way of achieving goals by getting others to do what you want through fostering shared values, as opposed to hard power, which uses coercion or military force. The term soft power, a staple of international affairs and the language of analysts, statespeople, has been around for some time, and yet it remains rarely discussed outside of the context of foreign policy. It's used in global business, banking, trade, but it's not very often used in culture at all. It was coined in 1990 by the American foreign policy expert Joseph Nye, and the term is defined by Nye as the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payments. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideas, and policies. He then goes on to say, when you can get others to admire your ideals and to want what you want, you do not have to spend much on sticks and carrots to move them in your direction. Seduction is always more effective than coercion. Now, because we're looking at this from a sort of point of view of visual culture broadly, or point of view of kind of cultural work, I'm quite interested in looking at who is framing these messages and where are these messages coming from. So since 2010, the Institute of Government, which is an independent charity helping to improve government effectiveness in the UK, and Monocle, the Global Affairs and Lifestyle magazine, founded by somebody called Tyler Brûlé, who started Wallpaper magazine. These two organizations have been publishing what's called the Soft Power Index. Now, this is Tyler Brûlé, the founder of Wallpaper magazine, which most of us are aware of and know from airports, if nothing else. So he's a kind of very well-known style icon. and also a major international businessman. The reason I'm showing you the actual images of the magazine and the kind of past project of Tile Brûlée is just to point to the visual representation and precision in the way that these ideas are communicated, to say that this isn't data for data's sake. This isn't just presented in any old graph, in any old magazine. This is very stylized. This is really, this is the soft power index, which in itself embodies soft power, in a sense. As an aside, so Tile Brûlée is behind Monocle and Wallpaper, as well as Wing Creative. And Wing Creative is a sister company of Monocle. And as it happens, one of their specialisms is national branding. So one of their lines of work as a branding agency is branding nations. So, for example, Thailand and more recently the Tourist Board of Taiwan. So I'm trying to create links here between these notions of soft power and visual representation and effectively the kind of visual elements of getting these messages across. So I bring this up as a visual aid to think about who the messages are being sent to and by whom. And this information is definitely not aimed at cultural workers. So as curators, we very rarely think about soft power on that level. We're very much thinking about the content of artworks. We're not thinking about the broader national messages or the kind of broader representational messages that are being sent through the works of art that we are involved in. So the soft power index, which is, so this is just some imagery of Taiwan. So the soft power index, which is this document that appears every year, charts which nations are making most of their cultural and business assets. It is drawn up following a complex analysis of 5 indices, broadly divided into culture, diplomacy, education, business and innovation, and government. So within the culture sub-index, within these categories, there are 50 individual factors that are used for countries to be ranked according to a soft power index. And the last one, looked at 40 countries. So and as you can imagine, none of these countries that we've been mentioning here are on the soft power index. It's very much the larger and very, very established nation states that enter into the soft power index in the first place. So within the culture sub-index, the study looks at film festival success, gallery attendance, number of World Heritage sites, status of international football, Olympic profile, the music market, record label sales, and so on and so forth. So this is these are images from the soft power index, which is available online. And is very easy to get hold of. So it's only in the past few years, perhaps due to Monocle's user-friendly and well-publicized soft power index, that's actually at this point aimed at the general public because of its kind of user-friendly design and distribution, that the term has become widely known and frequently discussed in the media. Perhaps at time without a genuine understanding of its meaning. So, for instance, these days you get broadsheets like the UK newspaper, the Daily Mail, that are quick to attempt to cash in on Britain's status in the soft power survey. And by the way, Britain wins, has been winning the soft power index, or being number one, winning being the wrong term, for some years now. So at a certain point, the Daily Mail published a major headline saying, "The sun may have set on the British Empire, but this country is once again the globe's most powerful nation by at least 1 yardstick." So kind of completely twisting it to sort of, promote this kind of like, here we are, the empire's back. So soft power then is essentially a measure of how likable a country is, how able it is to represent itself in the most favorable light by capitalizing on its positive points. And it's something to which governments across the globe are paying increasing attention. So it's less about the country's actual number and quality of assets and more about its ability to recognize and nurture and benefit from and market its potential. So not unlike sex appeal, it has little to do with natural beauty as such and more to do with the ability to flaunt whatever it is one has in the most marketable way, making the most of the assets. As it happens, soft power, according to Monocle, is easier to lose than it is to obtain in the first place. Sometimes a freak incident, say mad cow disease, a mass murder, a major traffic disaster, can send the country's image abroad spiraling downwards. Of course, if you look, for example, at the Sochi Olympics, that's a kind of perfect case study in the negotiations of Russia's soft power. So thinking about culture from the perspective of the soft power index as one of many pieces of the jigsaw puzzle used to create a particular image, I would like us to think about the relationship between cultural production on the ground, as I mentioned earlier, and top-down national representation. So in broader terms, the problem of representation and autonomy. So does art, does the individual artists and artworks have any possibility of autonomy or agency to transcend this discourse and to transform real social relations beyond this kind of instrumentalized form of representation? What plausible ways might there be for artists to negotiate the issue of representation and to strive towards some form of autonomy? So these are the kind of questions that I'm trying to think about in this presentation. Or could we possibly think that it's just completely doomed and it is impossible for an artist as just an individual player to somehow have an individual voice within this bigger picture? So we know that the relationship between representation and possibility of autonomy has been theorized extensively. And from many different ways of seeing. One of the perspectives is the sort of approach by Barthes, who talks about mythology and terms myth as depoliticized speech. And then the very task of national representation and soft power is to mythologize and market the cultural and social life of a country, depoliticizing it in the process by removing its social context and history, and only presenting the myth of its image, such as, cool Britannia, which we're all very familiar with. This kind of the kind of shortcutting between imagery and the sort of perceived ideas of how one wants to be seen. So Britpop, cool Britannia, French cuisine, Scandinavian furniture being just some of the most obvious examples. So if the mythic level of the sign becomes a way of concealing the country's actual nature, whatever that may be, but the kind of the nuances and the texture of the kind of reality, by presenting itself as truth, then soft power is the ultimate myth-making tool. So now shifting to the point of the view of cultural worker, artist, musician, curator, playwright, soft power is the unmentionable. It's a dirty word, synonymous with instrumentalizing culture for other, perhaps at times sinister political goals or other goals. So for discerning artists, curators, or producers, to embrace this terminology would mean to actively take part in the creation of a myth, to be complicit with a system of which they may be highly critical and from which they may wish to remain independent, regardless of which nation they belong to. Agencies of soft power like the Alliance Française, the British Council, Goethe Institute are the acceptable buffers of cultural diplomacy, mediating between governance and practice on the ground to the broad acceptance of all parties. But a direct head-on acceptance or declaration that a cultural work is actively contributing to the fostering of a certain national image is something rarely embraced by individual artists. Of course, at the same time, the artist is fully aware that soft power is the name of the game, so to speak, and that in cultural work of any kind, this is the language we speak with every funding application, in every sponsorship deal to which we agree, and above all, with every opportunity to appear at a national level in any form of a representational role. So we are aware that by signing on the dotted line, we are agreeing that our art, our theatre productions, texts, broadly add to and enhance and illustrate the strategic vision of our funder, sponsor, nation. And through our work, we become complicit in the construction of the mythology of a nation and its cultural policy. Like actors performing to a script, we become part of a narrative, one of many parts of the puzzle that commodifies the cultural life of a nation. So what can an artist do? Is there a possibility of autonomy? I keep returning to this question because I think it's really the only question to ask here. And for many artists, one of the possibilities, for many artists, the very notion of representation is central to the work. For instance, in her recent work, I will just show you an image, entitled Why an Artist Cannot Represent a Nation State, staged at the Musée de l'Art Contemporain Val-de-Marne in France in 2012, and subsequently in Zagreb in Croatia. Croatian artist Sanja Ivekovic, in collaboration with philosopher and longtime collaborator Rada Ivekovic, based in France, presented a performance dealing with the impossibility of national representation. The work was prompted precisely by the fact that Ivekovic was invited to exhibit during the Year of Croatia in France, in the context of a national festival entitled Croatie la Voici. It would be hard to find an artist whose work is less likely to serve as an ambassadorial purpose than Sanja Ivekovic. She's the kind of artist who stands for the marginalized, dispossessed, often highlighting the very social problems that cultural diplomacy tends to gloss over in favor of happier and more glamorous imagery. So for Ivekovic, the only way to participate in Croatie la Voici was to challenge and highlight the absurdity of the situation. So at one point, and her response was, yes, I will take part if I can play with this or if I can address this very notion. So at one point, and the piece is a text that is performed by or spoken out in France. It was Rada Ivekovic, so her collaborator. In Croatia, it was a number of activists who came and performed this text, and it is being interpreted by a sign language interpreter, which is this lady here. So at one point, we hear Rada Ivekovic exclaim, "Representation is an eternal puzzle of politics as well as of art. It is in both cases at once impossible yet attempted again and again, impracticable but necessary. You better be represented in some way than poorly represented, and the worst is not to be represented at all. Art and politics revolve around these two poles, the impossibility and yet the inevitability of representation." So there is no better embodiment of the impossibility and inevitability of representation than the Venice Biennial, which is internationally recognized and kind of the highlight on the art world's calendar, and it happens every 2 years, for those of you not involved in the art world, in a very grand way and very glamorous in Venice. The complexity of such an arena comes to the fore through the inherent contradiction between national representation and the exhibiting artist's resistance to representing anything and anybody but themselves. Anxious but complicit, critical but excited, the art world and its protagonists continue to embrace, use and abuse this diplomatic extravaganza, feeding off the codependent relationship between national interest and content providers. For an individual to accept, even momentarily, any form of national identification and furthermore representation would mean to accept that there is an absolute, solid, grounded essence of belonging, to accept that everything outside of that is other, and therein lies the problem. So what I'm showing you now are images of the work Borderless Bastards by Swedish artist Pia Backström, who represented Sweden in the Nordic Pavilion along with Andreas Eriksson, another Swedish artist, in 2011. And Fia's project was basically, she asked artists, curators, cultural workers across different countries to choose a public sculpture of a common person, so a kind of worker usually, a kind of national, representative, from the time when your nation state was created. She then created aluminium cutouts bearing digital reproductions of these sculptures, placing these knockoffs near the pavilions of their countries of origin. It's difficult to go into the work, but it was a fantastic way of questioning the whole setup of Venice. So you had a sound walk around Venice, and at each of these works, there was she recorded the interviews with cultural workers from that country. And what was interesting about her project was that she was playing with the kind of marginal representation of herself as somebody who is Swedish, lives in the US. She talked to a number of people who were very skeptical about this form of representation anyways. I was interviewed as a British person and as a Serbian person, and you can imagine the kind of mixtures that you get in these kind of in these sort of narratives. So it was very much kind of an invisible or barely visible navigation through the Giardini, which is where all the national pavilions are in Venice. I want to just move on to what I mentioned at the beginning, which is the term by Slavoj Žižek, which is this term over-identification. And moving on to kind of looking at different strategies that artists may use. So we have looked at this kind of critique of belonging or representation that perhaps Fia Backstrom and Sanja Ivekovic are employing. But a very different strategy is this strategy of over-identification. This is a term that Žižek borrows from Lacan, but applies it to politics rather than psychoanalysis. So Žižek defines the term as the idea of taking the system more seriously than it takes itself, taking it so far as to reveal its, this is Žižek's term, its hidden reverse. So over-identification seems to belong somewhere in the spectrum of parody, satire, sarcasm, irony, but unlike these other forms, mechanisms, it deliberately obscures any clear lines between two systems of knowledge. So over-identification finds logical paradoxes within the system rather than imposing external logic upon it to as such reveal its flaws, and is able to go beyond irony. So Žižek first used this term to describe Neue Slowenische Kunst, which was a multidisciplinary cultural political intervention which emerged in Yugoslavia in 1983, in the part that was then part of Yugoslavia, but today Slovenia. And it comprised a number of collectives. The best known is the band Laibach, which people may be familiar with. And initially, they're the most visible and best known, and the most disconcerting in many ways, component of NSK. And they incorporated elements of official Yugoslav discourse, of self-management and social democracy, using at times sections of Tito's speeches. So you see, this is the 80s, early 80s, and essentially Neue Slowenische Kunst appear as this incredibly problematic and uncomfortable artistic organization that no one really knows what to do with. And Žižek is sort of affiliated with NSK at the very beginning. This is the part Laibach, which is the band, and they were juxtaposing, for instance, Tito's speeches, images of phrases of the anti-fascist heroes of Yugoslavia, but combining them with elements of totalitarian regimes, as well as Slovenian local symbolism. So it's problematically they're mixing images politically, they're mixing images that are highly problematic at that point in Yugoslavia. In addition, their use of the German language in all their communication was, and their choice to call themselves Laibach, which is the Germanic name for Ljubljana, today the capital of Slovenia, was in itself incredibly problematic. So in this reworking of the Slovenian and Yugoslav history that invested their early works with such potency through the way that these familiar ideas were made strange and even very uncomfortable to audiences. So this is Laibach performed in the Yugoslav uniforms, army uniforms, because they were in the military service at the time. So they would literally come out in the evening and come up on stage and perform in the Yugoslav uniform. So it was sending up very, very complex and messages difficult to decode. So they were genuinely soldiers or in the military service at the time. These are, and Neue Slowenische Kunst had different branches, so to speak. So the musical branch was Laibach, visual arts group was Irvin, and still is, this is Irvin, playing very much with iconography of kind of the avant-garde. Design wing, new collectivism, theater, Scipion Nashice theater, and the Department of Pure and Applied Philosophy. And the image you saw, this was the Department of Pure and Applied Philosophy. So we're looking at a collective that is really kind of embodying the mechanisms of the state beyond sort of taking it more seriously than the state itself. So really going into kind of full representational modes. So NSK became very notorious in 1987, 7 years after the death of Tito, when they won a competition for the celebration, for the design of a poster for the celebration of the 25th of May, the Day of Yugoslav Youth, and the birthday of Josip Broz Tito, who had died 7 years earlier. Part of their proposal was a poster announcing the celebration. The poster was chosen by the generals and high-ranking officials of the Yugoslav government, and was represented in was printed in Politika, which is a national newspaper, the main Yugoslav newspaper, where an astute member of the public spotted a striking similarity to a Nazi poster designed by Richard Klein. So painting of the Third Reich, and informed the press. So this was a massive scandal, and NSK were banned, Laibach was banned from playing. So effectively, so what I'm trying to show is that NSK has been playing with symbolism in ways that are kind of very, very uncomfortable, and kind of really using and mixing symbols in a way that very much makes you question the kind of visual representations that we all kind of take for granted. So obviously this was a terribly embarrassing situation for the Yugoslav government. So in a way, so NSK then after that moved on to create a state, and it was interesting earlier we were talking about the temporality of states. The NSK state is a conceptual project, and it's entitled The State in Time. So it's part of this movement, which I'm interested to see that it hasn't come up, of micronations, which is kind of a number of artistic projects that are very prominent and very active. So NSK in 1992 went on to form the NSK state, the first global state in time. And today, NSK state has thousands of members. They issue passports. So it's a state that does not have a territory, but it has many thousands of passport holders. The passports are actually printed on the real paper of the Slovenian government, because it's a small country, and there was a moment at which they were able to do this. NSK is so popular that at a certain point the Slovenian government had to have a disclaimer on their website saying that this is the Slovenian website, this is not Neue Slowenische Kunst, because so many people were confusing the two. And there have actually been a number of applications, hundreds of applications from citizens of Nigeria wishing to become members of NSK state, believing that they could actually travel with NSK passport. So it's this kind of this moment where fiction and reality begin to merge, and having done a show of NSK, this is at a gallery, Calvi 22, where I was working in London, where we were issuing NSK passports, and people traveled from all over the world to come to get their passport stamped. So it's very much a sense of belonging. So there's kind of questions to be asked about about kind of what does this mean, even if you're fully aware that this state that you subscribe to does not really exist, but it fills your life with regular meetings, with regular gatherings, with publications, with this the NSK State Times, an online publication, NSK State TV. You know, it's kind of very meaningful for many people. So many of the projects involve collaborating with armies of different countries to sort of present these quite performative projects where they are effectively wearing the NSK uniform. So it's kind of this real merger and finding sort of cracks in the official infrastructures of different places where NSK projects take place to sort of assert the NSK statehood in a way. So to conclude, I just want to mention two other artistic initiatives that are very much in line with this notion of over-identification. One is a project by three artists, again from Slovenia. I think Žižek might have something to do with this happening so much in Slovenia. This is a project by three artists who officially changed their names to Janez Janša, who is the Prime Minister of Slovenia. And in 2007, they had received a letter, they had presumably signed up to receive, that said, a letter from Janez Janša that said, the more of us there are, the easier it is to achieve our goals. So they took this very literally and changed their names by deed poll to Janez Janša, and this is an ongoing project. There's a very well-known documentary about this project and about the range of situations that these artists are now getting into from 2007 onwards. And just to end on a more recent project, artist Jasmina Cibic, who represented Slovenia at the last Venice Biennial. She often collaborates with various rituals, mechanisms, and institutions of the state apparatus to create her works. And in 2007 as well, as part of her project, Tourist Welcome, took place at the airport in Ljubljana, and she collaborated with the State Police Orchestra of the Republic of Slovenia. And they performed live in the new terminal building, brand new terminal building. And the orchestra used the same performance protocols that they use when playing for visiting foreign states people, standing in formation and coordinating their movements under the instruction of a conductor. Instead of the usual repertoire of national songs, the orchestra played Giorgio Moroder's I Feel Love, disco music that was originally written for Donna Summer. And Cibic commissioned a new 7-minute orchestral arrangement of the songs, especially for this performance. And it's very much playing with the idea of the Slovene national and economic and tourist slogan, I Feel Love, because the spelling of Slovenia, you end up, it spells love within the word Slovenia, so Cibic is very much playing with this. So the people coming into the country were greeted by this kind of official orchestra playing I Feel Love, and she also inserted slogans around the airport such as stay for a little bit longer and things like this. And just, so this is all part of Cibic's project. And most recently at the Venice Biennial at the Slovenian Pavilion, entitled For Our Economy and Culture, Cibic presented a series of interventions which dealt with not only the power paradigms inherent in systems of authority, but also the explicit contradictions present in the transmutation of national identity from past to present and from place to place. So she essentially worked with numerous layers and forms of national representation, starting from the architecture of the Slovenian Pavilion, which is a repurposed private residence, and working with a whole range of organizations within Slovenia. Without going into too many details of this project, it is interesting that Cibic's project was very much the creation of the image of national identity and very much the critique of it within that image. But it's interesting that since then, Yasmina has been invited to participate in a lot of EU political gatherings. So last time I saw her, so it's very odd because I'm suddenly being called upon to be sort of some form of a representative of Slovenia, which is very very ironic in that she's very much kind of placing a critique, putting a critique forward, yet she is finding herself in completely uncharted waters. So just to conclude, Victor Bergen had said that the only imaginable non-political being is a totally self-sufficient hermit, alluding to the impossibility of remaining independent of the wider system in which an artist operates. If all art is complicit to some extent with the superstructures within which it develops and operates, does even the most critical voice become muted when presented within the market-driven ecosystem of biennials and exhibitions at the service of national iconography? Is non-participation the only possibility of autonomy? As the work by Sanja Ivekovic suggests, self-imposed exclusion is not a solution either. As she says, you better be represented in some way than poorly represented, and the worst is not to be represented at all, because what does non-participation achieve? Not very much. So the impossibility of an autonomous voice suggests that perhaps the only option may be to work with the possibilities of being represented in some way rather than in no way at all. Cibic's over-identification, or NSK's over-identification with the role of the Slovenian representative at Venice proposes one possible model for dealing with the problem of representation, that of becoming the myth-making machine, only to reveal in the process the inherent paradoxes and highlight the mechanisms of depoliticization. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, are there any questions immediately? Yeah.
Question, thank you, that was great. Just on the topic of the Venice Biennial, do you know of any artists who have refused representation?
Not specifically. I have heard of many problematic representations and of many difficult negotiations, but I don't, off the top of my head, know of anyone who has flat out said no. I'm sure it's happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I was wondering whether you could possibly relate this to Abkhazia in any way. Do you know much of it, about its soft power? I mean, you said only 40 states qualify, but what about its cultural, is there any element of cultural projection of this state?
Well, that's maybe a question for Max, not so much for me. I personally wouldn't know of much cultural output from Abkhazia, and maybe, you know, that's something to think about in terms of the kind of the process of what does a state, what can a state prioritize, or what are the messages that can be sent out. I don't think that Abkhazia is at a point, I would imagine, to be thinking too much about these kind of messages. And unofficially, yes. But I think it's interesting. I mean, you know, these kind of questions kept coming up. Like, for example, when in the film, when you talk about this boat that appears, this kind of carcass of a boat, that is, and at one point you say that that's the first thing that the first image that people associate with Abkhazia, and you know, so that's kind of something that happens by default, and I imagine a country needs to work hard to then move away from that image to imagery that it wants to represent itself by, and that in itself, that process is the process of developing its soft power. But of course now, with Sochi, Abkhazia has been very present, and you know, for instance, anyone that I've spoken to about this project is like, oh, okay, this is, you know, it feels very current, and that's interesting, you know, what is Sochi doing for Abkhazia, and in what way? So, you know, it's just...
Sorry, I'm not aware of what Sochi is.
Oh, just by...
Yeah, I know, but is Abkhazia
Yeah, it's very close, and just it's kind of it has been mentioned a lot in articles about Sochi. I mean, perhaps you want to.
Do you want to comment on that, Max?
Lina, I thought that was really interesting. I have a question because it's kind of despairing. The conclusion, in fact, huh? That there's an impossibility of not being part of the game, in a sense, right? Because both the examples you give, though, but I wonder about the examples because you give examples of artists who are basically either deciding to play within the framework, using the discourse of the state, or adopting the framework as their own and kind of playing with that, right? Yeah. But what about art, which is not even not even concerned with the framework, or not interested in the Biennale? What about the art which is not interested at all in that kind of
politics?
That's what. Yeah. I mean, is that? Are you discarding that? I'm just worrying. Where does that fit? Okay.
I think that there's plenty of art that doesn't directly in any way engage with it, but it's still part of a framework, part of a wider framework. And perhaps that's not important to that particular artist, but it still functions within it. So whether one addresses it or whether one chooses to just operate within it quite happily, it's all kind of part of the same continuum. How much you actively ask these questions is a personal choice for any artist, I think. But I don't think, as that's why I quote Victor Bergen, I think that this idea that you can operate outside of frameworks of representation, to me, is an illusion. I think even if you're in your garden painting a landscape, you're still operating within a framework of be it your nation or your funder or your particular moment in time, politically, geographically, and all of that. And
that's the examples you give are not showing that. If you give us an example of an artist painting in his garden, and then showed us how the framework was actually, then I might go with you. But that you still have to, in the case to convince me at least in that case, like it's impossible for anybody to step outside. I mean, these cases are they're clear examples of somebody who's conscious and taking it on board, and actually they're going to the Biennale, which is more than a conscious choice. I mean, it's huge in terms of dealing with the state. But what about somebody who's not at all? Why would they necessarily be?
I think that they are not actively engaging, but they are passively, sort of by default. I mean, as an artist, you operate within infrastructures that enable you to be an artist. So by, to make it concrete, at some point you're going to either receive a studio or be funded by your city or, Arts Council or something like that, or the Ministry of Culture. That in itself, you may not be engaging with it. You're not thinking, what am I saying about Norway through this piece? But Norway is thinking about what you're saying about Norway through that piece, if you think about it. So you can choose not to think about that at all, and that's absolutely fine. But, unless you make a point of saying, but I am not Norwegian, but then you're engaging with it. You're automatically somehow described as having some form of belonging. So, you may say, I don't know, such and such an artist. First thing that would come up in their CVs is a Norwegian artist. That in itself is a form of belonging and a form of engagement, like it or not. And I think it's absolutely fine also to not engage with it. Perfectly viable position.
Okay, I see there's 2 more questions, and then I think we have to, after those 2, end this part. So,
thanks. I think that there's even more subtle engagement, such as where I'm based in Glasgow. There's simply the buzz of artists within the creative city. Your being there is branding, marketing for the city, for whatever forms of tourism, mostly shopping. So simply by being there and your activity in being there is recuperated in more and more complex ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've just said in a very succinct way what I've been trying to say in very complex ways, but absolutely, just by your existence, just by your kind of activity, or just sheer, defining yourself as an artist, you're kind of contributing to some form of, you add to the statistics, if nothing else, even if you're not producing much work, but you're kind of, there's artist studios here, and that's just something that's interesting to think about. It's not necessarily sinister. Doesn't have to be. It's just facts. And I think in Britain, because Britain is, as we've seen, so good at getting the message out and so good at its soft power, maybe we're a little bit more attuned to kind of thinking about these questions, because you're so aware of constantly being part of some form of representation, be it, tied to creative industries or gentrification, here's Shoreditch, now artists are moving out, but hey, we had this creative, it's all kind of it's so much part of your life that it's very difficult to kind of operate outside of it. Maybe Britain more than other places.
So thanks for an interesting presentation. I just wonder if we could try and situate Erik's project within this kind of conceptual framework that you set up, which as Leon said, is slightly discouraging in a sense. It seems like the options are either assimilation into soft power or over-identification and somehow accelerating the system beyond itself or something. It appears to me that what Erik does doesn't really fit into this economy, and that he somehow pries open a space of reflection that's not really obviously instrumentalized in terms of some kind of cultural representation and so on. So I just wonder if you have a comment on this.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think that Erik's work brings up a number of these questions, but in very roundabout ways, which is what's so good about it. It makes it it kind of makes you ask a whole range of questions without asking those questions itself, and that makes it very powerful and very good, I think. So for me, it's kind of in the if we're looking at a range of positions, it's a very how to put it. It's choosing to step away from it, but by its very nature, as a viewer, you are in a way forced into this space of questioning these positions, and I think that makes it powerful work. But and also I don't think it's a spectrum from over-identification here to painting flowers in your garden. It's not like that. It's like a whole field of complex positions that are constantly shifting, to now go into a bit Bourdieu kind of form of representing it. It's a field where, as an artist, I would imagine you are constantly renegotiating your position. You're thinking about it even if it's not necessarily present and visible in your work. And as a curator too, you're always kind of thinking, where do I stand in this field of negotiations?
Okay, thank you very much once again. I think we're going to need 2 minutes maybe for a quick changeover, and then we continue on. I think we're a bit behind schedule, so we try to make it fast.